Welcome to Pier-Glass Spotlight number 2, where we will visit one poem and its author. I'm Stan Galloway, your host, and I'm very pleased to look at Undomesticated with Gerry LaFemina today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stan, for having me.
Gerry is the author of 15 poetry books and chapbooks, most recently, Baby Steps in Doomsday Prepping. His work has won numerous awards, including the Pushcart Prize and the Bodegera Prize in Poetry. He is also the author of Composing Poetry, a classroom or self-paced guide to poetic practice and principles. Let's start with the poem.
Undomesticated. The large goose does what it always will, pushes aside the smaller fowl for crusts, ducks its head below the surface briefly, then makes a horrible raspy honk. It's lovely in its being, even if no one would call it attractive. I've come to understand the Buddha nature once more, an excuse I use sometimes to leave the house and the 2 bodhisattva cats that meditate there on cushions of sunlight. Once, as a child, I was chased by a giant gander, nearly 3 feet tall, bill open, dirty feathers fluffed with rage. My mother laughing with her camera. Who wouldn't think it comedic? So often I fled from anger, even my own. The sun, like a gong reflected in the pond, vibrating in silence. At water's edge, a muck of mud and guano. I've come to repent. The birds to mate and cohabitate, maybe to rest. They eye me with a distrust and hunger I've seen on certain panhandlers in distant cities. On the far shore, a boy pitches stones sidearm, so they skip 4, 5, 6 times across the surface. I can almost hear him cheer, arms raised at a new personal record. Then his mother comes with a bread bag, takes his hand. Science has it that it's dangerous to feed bread to birds, and still so many come. Rumor has it a bobcat roams the area. The mauled remains of duck and small game have decorated the weeds and walking paths. Fur has been collected, scat too. It stalks quietly, keeps to itself. Good Nietzschean that it is, it too could teach me about appetite, about patience, about will to power, about viscera. That noise it makes, what little difference between a growl and purr.
Thank you, Gerry. That was very nice. In an interview with Rock and Sling, you said, I'm interested in place and how we exist in it, personally, emotionally, spiritually. What do you see concerning those 3 levels of existence in this poem?
Well, I think it all starts actually with that pond, with that place, which actually is one in my head. This poem actually started with this image of the sun like a gong. It shows up very late in the poem. And then I imagined how I would use that, and I started to imagine the sound of a gong as ripples on water. And so that place, that sort of, it's a mental image, but it's one that I have seen many, many times. I love bodies of water. And so I sort of created this place, and what does it have? Well, water has baptism implied with it, but there's also this other thing. I used to go feed ducks bread. Now I bring seed, but I love to feed animals, and they fight. They, they exist in their hunger spot on, and that's in a way that we often don't allow ourselves to. And so that that space of the implicit baptism, that implicit, very also animalistic at the same time, where you have birds and you have, and then this sort of human desire to feed animals, to nurture, and how all that sort of comes together in that space, personally and spiritually, is there, but also emotionally. The image of my mother and being attacked by a goose when I was about 6, that's actually true. And my mother laughing about it because it's kind of funny, is also true. But water has always been an important place for me personally. I think it's cleansing. I think part of it is the spiritual ramifications of it, but also the sort of tactility of water. It can be warm, it can be cold, it falls through your fingers. It is such, it freezes over. I just love water for its sort of the complexity of its being, both in what it houses, what it provides for, and also its very realness. And that's pretty much all I can say about it at that level, at least intellectually.
In a similar vein, in that same interview, you said, every poem for me is an attempt at understanding the universe and my role in it. What do you see in Undomesticated? What do you see it saying about one's role in the universe?
I think this poem is all about non-duality. You know, undomesticated, of course, is a kind of joke because we are completely domesticated creatures in many ways, and yet we have this entire undomesticated part to ourselves. Right? The geese seem passive, but of course, a goose will attack you if you are a young child with bread. As it turns out, they smell fear. It's about the sense of how do we go about finding the Buddha nature, which is that place where you accept who you are and what you are in the universe without fighting it. And the cats in the poem, they're described as bodhisattva. A cat is a great example of an animal that exists in its Buddha nature. It does not try to please the way a dog does, right? It pet me, don't pet me, I don't care. Feed me, don't feed me. I might pee on your pillow, but I'll go out and catch a mouse. There's very much a, people find cats cold, but I actually find them to be very grounding. They teach me that to remember to accept myself. And so this poem opens with this large goose doing what it always will. I mean, it is the bully goose, and if you ever watch geese, the bigger geese know they're the bigger geese. But we aren't surprised when animals do this. We watch the Discovery Channel, and we like, watch the predator beast, spring. The predator hawk comes down and grabs a mouse and flies off, and we go, ooh. But when people do this, of course, we freak out. Although, we're only X number of thousands of years from caves, right? From the trees. We still have our animal selves. And so it's this idea of simultaneously accepting that we are domesticated, but we have an undomesticated side. We have a part of us that is always feral. We could think we are incredibly passive and peace loving, etc. But if somebody threatened my kid, I'd be all up in arms. I would not back down. And sort of coming to that acceptance that, and I've been really thinking about this over the last particularly 5 or 6 years, as we live in a time of greater violence, of people to people violence. I want to simultaneously understand how we've become to accept undomestication, how we see basic respect and kindness as a bad thing. I'm trying to understand because I feel like there are a lot of large geese metaphorically in the world
Mm-hmm.
right now. And I'm not a large goose in many ways. And I also know I'm incredibly privileged. And I think that how do we tread that balance as a species, as a person, is becoming I don't want to say more and more of a challenge, but I think surely more and more of a question.
Yeah, and I think that's a question that all of us can ask ourselves, from whatever vantage we're looking at domestication and undomestication.
Yeah, I think we all have. I mean, you know, I'm gonna think of it this way. What philosophies appear in this poem, right? You have the Buddha nature.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be, but then, of course, good Nietzschean that it is. But there's also this recognition that perhaps at least the speaker has a good Nietzschean in him too, or perhaps a bad Nietzschean in him. But that idea that we have to exist with both that yin and yang. The mother who laughs at being attacked by the geese and the mother who cheers the sun. That these things are part and parcel of who we are, I think is crucial.
Yeah. Would you say that is the central, the core of the poem, or are there other layers that you would like to pull out from this poem as well?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that the poem engages these kind of planes of existence. There's feeding going on, but there's also muck and guano, right? We often sort of think about shit, for lack of a better word, as this horribly negative thing, although all it is the product of our digestion that keeps us alive. And it is this place, literally in the poem, is this place between the land and the water. It is this sort of nether space. The way it kind of is for us. It's that nether space between what's useful in the body, what was useful for the body, and what came out of the ground to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that danger exists, but we have to be able that danger exists, but it's not always dangerous, right? The last image is how little difference there is between a growl and a purr, which if you've ever had cats, you kind of know that. And so
Right.
I just imagine this sort of bobcat watching this animal, sort of this animal that's about to attack, simultaneously purring and growling with hunger, like that. How close those two sounds must be, and how those things exist in us.
And that last part of the poem, the poem takes a turn at rumor has it, where the attention moves from the geese to the bobcat. And structurally, this final section is about 1/4 of the poem. Yet, I think it's that 25% that stays with the reader. Can you talk a little bit more about the pacing and what in that first 75% of the poem is there to make that last quarter have its strength?
I think I alluded to the Discovery Channel before.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the power of I think one of the reasons why we watch those animal documentaries, whether it's Discovery Channel or David Attenborough or something like that, is that the setup is everything. Poems work like a joke in many ways. A punchline isn't a punchline without setup.
Right.
And so, right, Howard Nemeroff, I think it was, said that that a poem works like a joke, but a poem ends in laughter. A joke ends in laughter, and a poem ends in silence,
Mm-hmm.
which I kind of like. So part of it is for the bobcat to have any power, you have to invest emotionally in what the bobcat's going to eat, the danger that's implicit there. But the danger is not just to the ducks; it's to those little boys too, right? A little boy gets lost there. Bobcat will take down a little boy, probably. So part of the timing of the poem, part of it is I'm asking you to invest in what seems to be at first a kind of standard pastoral poem.
Mhm.
But what's at stake in the standard pastoral poem is very little. So danger has to enter this landscape for it to resonate. But it's set up. I mean, the geese already, the attack geese, the bully geese, and the phrase "I fled from anger." But the bobcat's not angry. The bobcat's just hungry. The bobcat is doing what the large goose will always do too. But the other thing is this idea of non-duality. All that's being set up in the early part of the poem, memory and present tense. The birds being fed breadcrumbs, even though it's dangerous. The sunlight and the water. So you have sky and the water. All these things are being sort of set up, and the Buddha disappears from this poem and is replaced by Western philosophy in the form of Nietzschean and the will to power. And I don't know if the Nietzschean stuff would make any sense without all that setup. And so, I do think that, you know, in an earlier draft, the poem was much longer at the beginning, and that didn't work. And there was also probably a version that was about 6 lines longer at the end, but it took the punch away. There has to be something simultaneously threatening and sweet at the end of this poem.
Right, the growl and the purr.
But in an earlier version, those were separated out until I just reduced it to the two things. Boom. And, but the scat comes back, the guano comes in as animal scat. So what I had to do was I had to take some of the breadcrumbs from the early part of the poem to hold it all together and sprinkle them in those last 8, 10 lines, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
so that you don't go, this is a separate poem, but all these elements are coming back in.
Right. Yes. Well, this has been an excellent discussion, and I appreciate you joining us. Is there anything you'd like to add to help us appreciate the poem more fully?
No, I spent a lot of time with the lines trying to have some fun, and I'll point out one, which is the second line: pushes aside the smaller fowl for crust. Ducks seem to be one of the smaller fowl, right? But then the line breaks there and goes, ducks its head below the surface briefly. And I love when poems allow me to get that kind of counterpoint in when the meaning of the line is different than the meaning of the sentence. I spend a lot of time with that, but again, that's that whole sense of non-duality. That meaning is somewhat relative based on how structure works.
Yes, yes. No, and I love when a poet is able to accomplish that in a poem, so that in a single word, we have two layers, working at the same time. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us today. Gerry LaFemina teaches at Frostburg State University, as well as serving as poetry mentor for Carlow University's low residency MFA program. His work can be found in many anthologies and journals, as well as his own collections. You can learn more about him at GerryLaFemina.com. For Pier-Glass Poetry, I'm Stan Galloway, wishing you a poetic day.